Okay, thank you, and welcome everybody. My name is Blakely Nixon. I think most of you know who I am now, but I'm the Communication and Events Coordinator at the Validate Network. And welcome to this, our last but one seminar in a series that we have derived from a skin NTD, vaccine for skin NTD workshop, which took place in Bogota in March last year, nearly a year ago now. And we thought the talks were so good at that during that workshop that we would share them with the wider membership. So this is we've got one more after this, which I will obviously plug in the chat, etc., and you should definitely respond. Um, so today I'm going to introduce our two speakers together. We're going to hear the two talks, and then we're going to do a question and answers. So I'm just going to introduce our two speakers at the same time. Our first speaker will be Mrs. Alexandria Cossio. She's at CIDEIM in Colombia. Alexandra is a clinical research fellow at Novartis in Switzerland and the co-lead for clinical and community research at CIDEIM in Colombia. She has more than 15 years experience focused on NTDs, and she's here to talk about the social challenges of clinical research in skin NTDs. And our second speaker, who will start straight after Alexandra, is a Professor Elena Bottazzi, an internationally recognized vaccinologist and global health leader. Elena co-created the patent-free COVID vaccine technologies behind Corbavax and Indovac, and she will be talking about an integrated vaccine sciences with social, economic, and policy perspectives. So we're going to hand over first to Alexandra, and for her talk. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much to invite me to this seminar. Let me share just a moment, please, to share the. Okay, can you see my slides?
I can see your slides perfectly.
Okay, thank you very much to invite me to this seminar. It's a pleasure to see many people around the world. So good morning and good afternoon. Today I would like to share some key lessons learned regarding the social challenges of conducting research on skin NTDs in remote rural areas in Colombia. In addition, I'm going to describe context-based strategy that we implemented to overcome this challenge. To start, I briefly contextualize cutaneous leishmaniasis in Colombia to better understand the social barriers that we faced when conducted research in rural setting. So, although the incidence of cutaneous leishmaniasis has been decreasing in Colombia in recent years, still there are many places that you see in the map in red with high burden of disease. But CIDEIM has been working in two areas. One is Pueblo Rico in the Risaralda department. Another is Tumaco in Nariño department. Despite both being in Colombia, their social, cultural, and geographical context are totally different, and this is a big challenge for us. Around 80% of cases of CL occur in rural areas, and it means a high cost for family because most of them live very far from the health system or the health centers. That you see in this picture, this is one village in Tumaco. This is in the jungle, and the transportation in Tumaco is mainly by boat. It's a fluvial transportation. And in our study, what we did in the past, the transportation expenses represent around 25% of the minimum monthly wage per family. In contrast, for example, in Pueblo Rico, the transportation is mainly walking, motorcycle, or in some patients by horse. Other important issue is Colombia, the biodiversity is huge. We have multi-ethnic groups. In Tumaco, most of the people are Afro-Colombian. In Puerto Rico, we have three ethnic groups. Indigenous people, mestizos, are Afro-Colombian. This diversity implies different cultural challenge in each setting. I will now present a video developed in Puerto Rico. It was done by social research team led by Dr. Elena Bautista. This video illustrates the main challenge that we face when planning and conducting research on neglected tropical diseases.
Tajina embenana choco de bemanande Dos roma le buru tai puru da bumande Taji tua de bura de homa ak di mande Dos roma para de homa ero buma Taji so para de homa ero panuma Paito buru de mena via ero bumate Tajina embenana choco de bemanande
Maharamuba, explica Ina María, dai baita, dai buena, en vena baita, difícil bu, lideresa bai, sagaya porque dai ba, mukina ba permiso de du webunu, dai hoya ni reunión na wanakau, mamara solo buena jaudeba, dai yo me difícil bu, dai nan evento da o encuentro da o capacitación na nena y baita dai ba, na mukina ma idi patau permiso, mamang ba gobernador ma idi patau. Mang lo dos pa mukina pa mang de gobernador bida dai ma
dai wena difícil bu ada wandai platama ifone na fede baune badai kafoni bede kafasi etende da ba fede baune a espagnol kasi bede da hauba dai awa palta hanu
dai ba nau ne sahanu sawa chona dai capacitación anau ne aprende dai baita Humarama idea de dai baita intercambio de dai baita kanen bara kafunia embena ni orona bara mau bara organización mau bara organiza daya huma bauda organiza daya.
Para las indígenas es más diferencial ser líder porque hay menos estudio, menos trabajo y muy pocos recibir sueldo.
Bueno, la diferencia que hay entre ser líder hombre y lideresa mujer es grande. ¿Por qué? Porque las mujeres tenemos un rol más grande, las mujeres tenemos que ocuparnos de nuestros niños, de la comida, si tenemos parcelas también alrededor, las hortalizas, todo eso. Entonces los hombres por lo menos ellos dicen, si vamos para una reunión y nos le toca a la mujer o al hombre, tú sabes que tienes tus hijos, tú sabes que tienes que hacer la comida, mientras ellos se van.
Las mujeres afro enfrentamos dificultades para ser lideresas por la falta de apoyo de la comunidad y en especial por la falta de empoderamiento y confianza en nosotras mismas.
So that you saw in the video, the cultural context and cosmovision differ between regions is totally different than the Afro-Colombian people think compared with the indigenous people. On the other hand, violence and extreme poverty make the implementation intervention complex. There is many language barriers with indigenous populations, There are misconceptions about cutaneous leishmaniasis and its transmission. For example, the indigenous people think that the transmission is done by snakes, but in Tumaco, the Afro-Colombian people think that transmission is by a plant. All of them use traditional medicines and use different substances over the lesion before taking care at health facilities. Additional barriers include limited access to health services because the extension of the country, and there are insufficient health infrastructure and low coverage. There is a passive case detection, limited access to diagnosis, difficulties to administer the treatment, frequent turnover of health professionals, restricted follow-up to patient to follow the patients, and inadequate communication between health system and patients. So in this context, what we do to overcome this challenge. To address these barriers, we implement several strategies. One of them is before to start research in these rural areas, we need to do a context analysis to understand the social, cultural, and institutional realities, identification of key persons or stakeholders and community engagement. Understanding the motivation and concerns is crucial for effective engagement. Other is to do a institutional characterization to assess capacities, resources, and expertise that can contribute to the initiatives or the project's success. Build a relationship based on the transparency and trust with the community through open communication and active listening. A clear definition of roles and responsibilities, collaboration and partnerships, and co-creation the research process. This is really important because the thing that is the best to do not always is the best for them. So the co-creation process to do the research is important to be success. Continuous monitoring and evaluation, and the training needs to be cultural adapted to different cultures. For example, we did a book in collaboration with the communities, and the first one, you can find this in YouTube. And the first one was done with people from Tumaco, and all the environment was illustrated by them. And they use this book to train or to teach the people in the communities about the leishmaniasis, how it's treated, etc. And the second was a radionovela. Radionovela is a soap opera. It was transmitted by radio because the radio is the main medium in Tumaco. The radionovela was performed by people from there, and there are several captures, and they teach about leishmaniasis too. And the last one is a cartoon. It was developed by the indigenous communities. It's important to integrate the community in clinical research. We started in the beginning only share knowledge about the cutaneous leishmaniasis and the disease management, but after we subsequently include community members in clinical research, into clinical trials, in those studies, the people in the communities follow up the treatment adherence, and they help us to solve some small things that the people have about the research. And after we decide to involve to have more important role the communities on research in this study, we evaluate the performance of molecular diagnosis tests, comparing the sample collected by trained community health leaders with those processed and sampling in the reference laboratory. So we have two scenarios, the reference laboratory scenarios and the field scenarios, and the sample were collected by communities. The results shows no difference in the test accuracy between the two scenarios, and trained community members can facilitate the access to diagnosis. And other study that we did was using a mobile help to follow up the patients, and we evaluate the effectiveness of the mobile application that is called WARAD to monitor the treatment adherence and the drug reaction and clinical response. This app was operated by community trained health leaders. As you see here, this is the information that the communities collect, treatment adherence, adverse drug reaction, and take lesion photographs. And this information is captured in the place where the people live. After is stored in a cloud, and the physician can evaluate the clinical response based on the picture that the community health leaders took. Based on that, the physician evaluate if the patient cured or not cured. The results of this study shows that the 82% of people, of patients, have follow-up after 90 days compared with only 4% on the standard of care. All patients in the WARALST group have at least one follow-up compared with the other group, the standard of care, donde most of the patient doesn't have any follow-up. The treatment adherence was known in most of the patients in the mobile health group compared with the standard of care, donde around 50% of the patients, the treatment adherence is unknown. This project was a challenge because most of the community health leaders were indigenous people. Still, they say that the data registration, photo capture, and lesion localization are easy to perform. But the main difficulties that we had was the transfer of information because the connectivity limitations. The patient and community health leaders think that this app facilitates the CL management, improves the effectiveness of health institutions. They feel more close to the health system, improve the medical care, promotes understanding of the disease. They recommend other possibilities to use the apps. In conclusion, social challenges in conducting research are complex, include cultural, language, access to health services, geographical, economical, and personal barriers. To overcome these difficulties, it's important to understand the context, the stakeholders, and institutions, and build the trust with them to work together in co-creating intervention that benefits both communities and research. Community engagement and interinstitutional collaboration are key to conductive research on skin-neglected tropical diseases, and communities need to be involved from the early phase of research. Mobile health is a strategy that can support skin NTD research by enhancing its implementation, sustainability, and scalability within health systems. So thank you very much. We work with many people, many collaborators, many communities. They were volunteer and in Tumaco and Pueblo Rico. And this is the team. We have people who help us to work in the rural areas, and she's Elena, the social scientist. We decide to work together to facilitate the success of the clinical research. And those are the people from CIDEIM and from other institutions and Universidad ICESI and the hospitals and secretarías departamentales de salud. They are the health authorities. There are many people who support us to do these projects. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. If you could stop sharing. A round of applause from the audience there. Are you ready with your slides, Maria Elena? Oh, great. Okay, so hand over to Maria Elena. So at your leisure, Maria Elena, you can start. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. How is everybody? I see a very nice, very broad audience, so I'm very happy, and thanks to the prior presentation, because I think it's going to complement what I'm going to present to you. So I'm actually going to focus on technologies, and of course I'm going to use the vaccines as technologies to give you a flavor of from the presentation that you heard before. How do you go kind of backwards and take into consideration, of course, those social aspects, those community engagement aspects, mix them together with economic and policy perspectives, and how this is going to help us create and design better technologies or tools from the laboratory that then can feed, of course, in the populations that need them. So I am going to just very generally remind you, of course, why we all love our tropical infectious diseases, neglected tropical diseases. Certainly, tropical medicine as a field of study has been very impactful and very influential, because we really address the burden of diseases that unfortunately afflict, many of our populations around the world, and especially those who may not have a voice, who are underserved. And of course, it's also the fact that they contribute to this cycle of poverty. So as much as we know, we know how they're very prevalent, of course, that they're very chronic, stigmatizing, disabling. They also may be major cofactors because they are co-endemic with other diseases. We now know there's also a lot of lives that people lose because they live in this constant morbidity, disability, health, and also eventually, of course, has a bearing in the productivity of that individual and certainly the economies of our countries. And don't forget that also these diseases, as much as we are going to focus on human health, we also recognize that this is a One Health problem, and that we also have, of course, to take into consideration not only other hosts, whether it's the animal hosts, but also environmental and, the vectors, and also any other reservoirs. On this slide on the right side, I actually found a nice paper that really summarizes a little bit how complex, while at the same time necessary, integrated way that you have to address the skin NTDs, right? And as much as you have to, of course, understand what are the NTDs that we are focusing on, that they're quite broad, but they also, as much as they may be caused by similar pathogens, they cause very unique, but at the same time, sometimes even similar types of disabilities. But it does require sometimes not a one fit for all approach, right? You have to have like a broad but integrated approach. And then on the last little square where it says shared public health measures, that's where, as you can see, there are very complementary, ideally integrated measures. And I'm going to focus primarily on how certainly the development of new vaccines, as you know, it's a very complex, long process, but at the same time necessary, right, to bring in to this shared responsibility to bring to the table additional tools. So when you start thinking, each of you in your areas of where you actually work in the continuum of this integrated approach to treat these, to handle and to control, prevent, or treat these diseases, think about where you are in that continuum, which I'll walk you through a little bit. And in fact, the way that I'm going to give you my presentation is I will actually start with the end, a little bit of what you heard in the prior presentation, right? What is this global access strategy? How do you handle the ability of developing interventions and tools that eventually will arrive to be able to be accessible, of course, affordable, that we can, it can be, replicatable, that, we can replicate it independent of what regions of the world we are. And that therefore it has, a strategy for access, right, for delivery. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. I will then walk you through this decision process, which sometimes is challenging because you have to be abreast of a lot of frameworks, that are driven by, of course, governments, policymakers, economic factors, also the demand, right? The user, the end user. And I'll tell you a little bit about how you have to start thinking a little bit out of your maybe scientific brain box, but go into how to look at these types of decision processes, inclusive of some of these concepts that are more looking at the investment cases, looking at the value proposition strategies, and constantly be aware of frameworks on top of frameworks, right? Changes in the types of frameworks, which unfortunately, they are pretty challenging. And I will give you an example of one of the relatively new frameworks that are, currently being created, which is this concept of also integration of combination in vaccines. But as you know, also, how would you even integrate a vaccine together with a deworming program, or a vaccine together with water sanitation, right? So, there's always combination approaches. I'll tell you a little bit about the absolute imperative importance of strategic partnerships and the type of partnerships, of course, we can take advantage and start learning, especially for technology development. I will then give you a little bit of maybe a homework for you to start also thinking of when you are training academically, training in the field, training with your areas of work, to never forget about the concept of regulatory science, which I'll tell you a little bit of what that means. And as much as probably I won't have time to go through a lot of the scientific trends, they'll be embedded, but if ultimately we need to take advantage of 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Which is this, policy, social, economic, aspects of technology development. You also, of course, have to be constantly learning and innovating and creatively looking at the scientific trends. And I give you a few that are, of course, important, which, of course, even understanding the diversity of vaccine technologies, right? I mean, we've heard, right? RNA, viral vectors, lipid nanoparticles. We have recombinant proteins. We have live attenuated. I mean, that technologies in itself can be quite diverse. Usually, they also have an interplay with what we call delivery systems, whether it's, injectable, oral, a patch, hand in hand with other immunostimulant or these adjuvant technologies. So again, as you can see, the science is also very complex. The fact that we now have to innovate also, how do you transition into what we call the clinical testing, right? And now the importance of a few interesting models, including what we call the control human infection model. So using the human as a model, but doing it in a control fashion rather than going directly into the field, which of course is costly and it's very burdensome, of course, to do clinical trials to establish efficacy and safety and immunogenicity. Always be abreast that artificial intelligence is here. We have to learn what it is, how it can actually benefit us. For example, we've been using it now a lot for how do you do better predictions for target identifications, but also can be quite innovative for when we do designs for our clinical trials. And then, something that maybe we won't touch in depth, but as you know, there's also that concept of the hesitance or trustworthiness on why we need to use these interventions. Certainly with vaccines, it's been quite challenging in the recent years. And we also therefore have to refocus, right? How we are presenting the value of these vaccines. And an example is how now there's a lot of interest in using them as personalized type of interventions, host-directed therapies, meaning that vaccines are not only for prevention now, but also could potentially be used as immunomodulators and sometimes even as treatment strategies. But for me to really go in depth, I want to just present to you in as much of a simplified manner possible, and even in a linear fashion, even though it's usually never linear. Usually things are very circular and very, you can start from different areas, but eventually they have to be all very integrated. It's the continuum of the path of any biotechnology, biopharmaceutical development, right? So, and you all probably play a role in one of these areas, right? So if you're, a laboratory scientist in the lab, in an academic environment or in some research institute, you probably play in this translational gap where you do discovery research, where you can do research and development, where you can understand the host pathogen relationships, the pathogenesis, the immunology, the microbiology, the biochemistry. The preclinical is where usually you transition in what we call a little bit critical path, where you start then engaging, for example, very sophisticated animal model developments, in vitro testing, manufacturing, formulation sciences, which of course are all necessary for, again, going to request permission to the regulatory agencies to then transition into what we call the clinical stages, which are these phase 1, 2, 3. And usually those are very much governed by what we call the first in human model, which, we want to do very nice and very robust research, but we really would like to transition into the human clinical trial stages very quickly, but keeping, of course, all the highest quality and certainly regulations, right? And there the game changes a little bit, right? And who are the players that eventually start entering, outside of academia when you go into the clinical stages, right? And there are many players. You could work with, of course, clinical trial sites, investigations that are certainly could be led by academia, but most of the times you also require a partnership with the manufacturers, right? You cannot go into the clinic unless you have a clinical grade material for you to use in humans, right? And I highlight here, as much as, you may work, arguably for NTDs is very rare that you can work with big for-profit pharmaceutical companies. However, I want to introduce you to a network, which is called the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network, which generally are the ones who really take a role when you want to develop interventions that are for diseases that eventually the technology will be used in countries where the diseases are found. And therefore, trying to align with a manufacturer that it's in the same region where the diseases occur. And, to give you an example, certainly Africa now is creating a lot of hubs of vaccine manufacturing. There's a lot of in the India country, that we have a few in Latin America. There's also some in Southeast Asia. So as you can see, that was one of the, of course, lessons learned from COVID, right, of how to diversify this and enlarge this network. And they're the ones who usually do a lot of the product launch activities, the long, arduous work that, of course, you do with the World Health Organization to get approvals for not only policy integration, but also quality and evaluation. They usually also do the implementation studies. And then they work with the low middle income countries to establish a pathway for the financing, the procurement, and eventually that access, right? That delivery, that uptake. So if you keep this model in mind, right, let's walk through what, if you are even working in that little discovery box, you have to understand what happens in that uptake box, right? Because you design your discovery on the basis of your intended North Star. What is the ultimate goal? So that's why I always start with the end, right? So people always talk about end-to-end strategy, right? How do you start with understanding what your access strategy will be? How do you start building the policy case? And there you have to, again, take into consideration, right? What is your pathway? What is the pathway that will need to be compiled and brought together? And of course, we in the lab focus a lot in the product, right? But we also need to understand how it would be the services that will be needed to deliver those products. And do we even have policies and practices and procedures that you can eventually then deliver them, right? So as you can see in the same continuum, right, from the discovery, research and development to the, all the clinical trial, proof of concept, how do you then scale, right, production and even scale in delivery? How do you create the needs assessment? How do you then design these products? How do you have to also build the capacity, right? And how do you build that evidence of need? And how would you even go into the delivery and implementation, right? And so this paper is very interesting because it really describes a lot of the things that, you can think about, okay? But of course, when you talk about, this building the investment case where we, again, you have to look at the entire continuum. If you really look at it, and if you even want to start thinking about vaccine development, we actually put them in kind of like 4 different buckets, right? The orange buckets are, again, those that maybe we shy away of because maybe as scientists, maybe we're not really a lot versed into this type of language, right? How do you understand the market? What are the opportunities? Maybe we dabble a little bit, again, in that regulatory or licensure path. But what is the finance model, right? Why would a country even decide to acquire and purchase an NTD vaccine, right? We also have, again, because of all the frameworks and changes, we have to understand What are the country demands? What are the demands of the people? What is the prioritization that, agencies like Gavi uses, or all the different frameworks of the WHO? But at the same time, we need to be very savvy of what will be the research, right? The science. So how are you going to design your preclinical studies? How are you going to design your clinical studies? How do you put it in the framework of regulatory? How are you going to manufacture the vaccines, right? And that pairs with, therefore, having very structured and intentional pathways, with the hope that you also gain access to funding, right? Which is always a challenge. But put into a little bit, maybe more tangible for you to see, there's actually a very nice paper that is back from 2017, but it really tells you a little bit that how do you integrate, these concepts within that continuum development, right? So, for example, a lot of us, we love the epidemiology. We love to understand the burden of the diseases. Where are they? What do they do? What's the public health need? How do we really understand, the pathogen, right? We heard a little bit, right, about how do you create demand? How do you speak to the populations? So creating this demand and forecasting, like who would use it? What would be acceptable? What would be a good use case, right? Do we even have a feasibility? How would you even distribute, a campaign, right? In this case, a vaccination campaign. Then there's clearly the science, right? How do you design a vaccine candidate? Do you have a pipeline? How do you select the best one? What studies do you have to do? How do you design against the clinic? What are the target profiles, right? What's the target indication, the target population? What is the characteristic, right? And the cost of how to make these products. Then you have, again, all the translation, right? How do you move it from the bench to the clinic? And then at the end, again, you have all these other areas, which are the economics, the effectiveness, work with the health economists, etc., right? So I alerted you that, the near future is actually already here. There's a lot of interest in combination vaccines. So for example, if you are very interested in looking at how to design interventions, we now know, right, that, we are at a stage where, countries have a really hard time, delivering so many different types of interventions. So not only the public health and the economic value is there to try to consolidate and integrate, maybe not even just combining vaccine interventions, but also combining with other interventions. But there's clearly a value for the society, for the children, of course, that will be vaccinated, for the parents, for the providers. There's challenges because it's not the same when you're developing a vaccine as a standalone, where you have, certain scientific premise, when you have to actually integrate it with other vaccines. Sometimes the vaccine combinations are for completely two different types of pathogens. Sometimes maybe the same pathogens because it has variability in strains, or even because of the mutation of the pathogen. So you have to see, right? So again, this paper really gives a quite nice landscape of the reasons why, thinking about designing interventions that eventually can become, have the ability of being combined, but also, of course, what are the challenges? I mentioned to you that we are actually quite lucky, right? And people maybe don't have a lot of knowledge about the fact that we actually have a pretty large and now even growing even more network of potential strategic partners that are not only interested in partnering with academia, to learn how to do this R&D and advance these vaccine technologies. But at the end of the day, if you are really serious of saying, oh, I would love to my discovery be transitioned into a technology that then can be evaluated and eventually delivered and licensed to be used for, the populations in need, I tell you that the strategic partners here are the manufacturers, right? They are the ones who really can help you. And we have a lot of them. They're the ones who actually already make most of the vaccine products that are supplied around the country. Maybe we don't realize it because sometimes they're co-branded with the big pharma. Sometimes they're indigenous and they're only delivered in the country. Sometimes they get pre-qualified and then can be exported. So keep an eye and investigate. And they are always very welcoming to have a conversation, even with groups like us that come up with an idea and say, okay, I want to develop a novel vaccine for one of the skin NTDs. How feasible is, what kind of things would you like us to do in the laboratory or in the field to compile the right evidence for you to then be interested in adopting this as one of your products, right? I'm going to then end a little bit in telling you a little bit about what is regulatory enabling science, which I think it was one of the big lessons that our vaccine center have been learning for the last almost 25 years. It's how to integrate these thematic areas and competencies when you work in the lab, work in the field, collaborate with partners, is to really understand what are the tools, the standards, and approaches that you need to have for you to therefore be able to abide by the regulatory agencies. And this is not just for US, for the big stringent European agencies or even high-income country agencies. This also applies for when you have to submit dossiers within your own countries, right? So whether you go even through your institution's IRBs or IACOCs for animal or human research, this is a little bit elevated, right? So it's a little the same principles, but way elevated. And it's really the science that allows you to make that decision-making process that you can fulfill the quality, the robustness, the safety of developing these biologics, right? So, and it ultimately means the following: documentation, 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 and how you develop the documentation framework falls within what we call a quality management system that allows you to follow very specific procedures of how you can confirm that you are documenting and performing studies in a lab, in the field, with reproducibility, with robustness, which of course it is an anchor of us scientists, right? It's not like we always do it, but the way that we document it, it's key, right? So that it can fit. And there's a few reports of how can you learn this? How can you develop yourself as part of the workforce that understands regulatory science? They're open access. You can just search the National Academy of Medicine. They used to be published when they were called Institute of Medicine, but the National Academy of Medicine. But you can certainly find a lot of information of that. And then I actually want to highlight this because I found this article in the Pharmacology and Translational Science Journal, which is actually called The Fundamental Characteristics of What is a Translational Scientist. And it actually presents it to you in a very novel way, right? Of how we individually, we all have different personalities, different interests, different capacities, different skills. Not necessarily that one is weaker or stronger than the other, but that's the reason why we work in teams, right? Because each of us brings something that really allows us to complement and strengthen the unit, right? So read it, find out who you are. Are you a boundary crosser? Are you maybe a domain expert? Do you really like to be the glue that allows you to play a role as a team player? Are you a process person? Are you a communicator? Are you more of a thinker, right? So read about this because I thought it was actually very nice because then it actually helps you create that network, right? Of what do you need for you to achieve the goals that you have by bringing in the right people that complements and supplements the skills that you have versus the ones that you may not have, but that you need to create a highly efficient team, okay? So lessons learned, focus on regulatory science, quality, documentation are key. I think we heard it loud and clear, right? That developing, technologies is not just the science. You need to understand the business perspectives. You need to understand the societal perspective. It's a very complex system, right? Of how do you put together that value proposition. And then maybe last that I didn't mention is certainly us that work on NTD, on the NTD world. We've always understood, right, that we have to work with open science, with the fact that what we want is our work to be for the public good. So we also have to be very intentional and innovative when we do, the so-called intellectual property management of, what do we patent, what do we copyright, what do we keep, proprietary. And we usually don't have a problem with that. We're always very open and as much as possible publish and share, right? Share knowledge, share experiences, and share our stories. So key takeaways, right? The funding and the policy prioritization is always challenging, but you know what? We have to be our own advocates and we have to advocate for our work and certainly our NTD skin diseases. Pay attention to these manufacturers. They're great partners. We certainly have to learn beyond the science, right? So think about the social aspects, think about the business strategies. And as much as it's challenging, we have to break that paradigm and move forward. So look forward to your comments. Thank you. Back to you, Blakely.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry, I was just muting our interloper there. Just letting my camera turn on. I don't know why it's taking so long. Thank you, everybody. Yes, so thank you very much, Mariana, for that brilliant talk. Now we move over to our attendees for the Q&A session. So does anybody have any questions? You can raise your hand electronically using the react button, like so. Yeah. Did you have a question, Alexandra?
No.
No. That's okay. So does anybody have any questions? Or if you're shy or you don't want to come on camera, do feel free to add a question into the chat. So anybody. It's probably a good sign that there aren't too many questions because it means you've covered everything. Okay. Sam Sampson says inspirational. Okay, Kieran, do you want to come on and ask that, or would you rather me read it? Okay, so Kieran has a question. So here I go. How can we promote vaccine research on NTDs in poor countries? NTDs receive minimal attention due to low commercial incentives and fragmented systems. Kieran would have come on, but her connection's a bit poor. So does that question make sense?
Sure. I mean, I can start, right? And again, that's the reason we are the advocates of the people who have these diseases that, as you know, as you said, right, sometimes they don't really have a voice, right? So we have to be the voice. We have to be the ones always advocating, always presenting. And as we saw in the presentation before me, right, it's having this experience and talk directly to the populations, because at the end of the day, they also have to join that voice and maybe bring it to their community leaders, bring it to their certainly government officials, so that people are heard, right? And I think we scientists, always sometimes forget, especially those of us who maybe are more laboratory bench scientists, but clearly types of programs like, stories like the video we saw in the previous presentation, maybe Dr. Cossio can mention this, right? That's the way to do it, right? I mean, we have to be the ones who help and then raise these voices.
Alexandra, would you like to add to that?
No, I agree with Dr. Bottazzi. I think it's important to motivate the people for get the rights, because it's an issue, the human rights. So I totally agree with you, and the mobilization of the community and institution is key, I think so.
I actually have a question that's really relevant to both of you because Mariana and Alexandra work both in high-income countries, Switzerland in Alexandra's case, the US in Marilena, and Colombia, and Marilena has worked all over the Latin America, for example. I want to ask about like the difference between working in a high-income country or Western country compared to working in a lower-income country like Colombia. Are there any advantages to working in like? Is there any sort of mindsets that are more positive in a lower-income country? The things that are beneficial, but generally, what's the difference in sort of working in your field in those different environments? I'll go with Alexandra first, if that's okay.
It's a difficult question. I really don't work. I haven't worked in a developed countries, but I was only did my fellowship in Switzerland, but I haven't worked with the health institutions, so I don't know exactly. But I think the resources maybe can be get easily than in the undeveloped countries. But I think, I don't know, my perception is that the work with the communities is more easy in developing countries than in the first world countries. I don't know, Maria Elena, do you think so or not? Because the people is easygoing, is more the relationship is easy to establish, but I don't know. I think in the developing countries this is more difficult. But the resources obviously is a big difference between them. What do you think, Maria Elena?
So my perspective actually is quite interesting because as much as you think that, yes, we are in a high-income country, what people maybe don't perceive is that even within high-income countries, we have mini low middle-income countries, right? Like I live in Houston. And as much as Houston is, of course, a large city, of course, it's actually the third largest city of the US. Sometimes between Chicago and Houston, we kind of like go between third and fourth largest city population. And certainly we have a lot of land in Texas, but we have a lot of poverty here, a lot of underserved populations. I mean, I honestly tell you, sometimes when we go into some of we even call them colonias here, it's the same as when I go to Honduras, honestly, right? So I think that's where maybe we have to also put it in perspective, right? And that's how we also have to raise that voice and that awareness that not everything is pink colored glasses in high income countries. And so we want to take advantage of that. And, and that reason why we struggle, because of course we work of course, our vaccine center is pretty much dedicated to primarily neglected diseases to develop these vaccines. But we also have to make the strong case of why we're doing it here. Of course, is with a global approach, but it's because eventually we'll also benefit, locally, right? I mean, we have Chagas disease here. We have, of course, now outbreaks of, dengue, West Nile, chikungunya. We've actually found even focus of hookworm in Alabama, right? I mean, so I think if anything for the group is sure, right? The United States is humongous. You hear a lot of, the developed components, but within the developed, there's a lot of underdeveloped, right? And I think we have to remember that now, it's not anymore, poor is here, and rich is here, it's all kind of intermingled. So we have the same challenges, to be very honest.
There are a lot of South Africans online, and do feel free to interrupt and correct me, but it's almost the opposite situation in South Africa, which is technically an LMIC, but there is actually a developed country sort of sharing the same space, and sort of a lot of the more Western. My very basic and limited experience of South Africa is sort of, America has some LMIC elements to it, even though it's a developed country. South Africa is almost the other way around. We have another question from Theolis. Is there a track of vaccines and development in the DCV MN initiated that can be consulted?
Yeah, and actually, I just added a link, Theolis. Unfortunately, fortunately, I don't know if it's a good thing or not because I'm not a big fan of lists. But when these agencies put out there, again, this framework where they say that WHO endorses this new list of pathogens that people should be focusing on developing vaccines, generally then, it's a soft endorsement that if a manufacturer then supports or collaborates or co-develops, a vaccine that is on that list, they eventually can get buy-in, right? Buy-in from again, the policymakers or even the countries, right? Because if WHO says, right, unfortunately. Now, I'm not a big fan because honestly, I'm never on the list, meaning none of my diseases ever make the list. We, I think, are fortunate that in the last list, I think Leishmania was actually, magically appeared on the list, which is good, but at the same time, now it's a challenge, right? To stay on the list. But then, how do you also collaborate and convince the producers that sometimes they just don't have to focus on paying attention to these lists, but also look at what the needs are of the country, right? And then really work directly. And that's what we do a lot, right? Is trying to present cases, right? So it's like, okay, sure, hookworm is never on the list, but hey, it's one of the leading causes of anemia, especially when it's co-endemic with malaria, for example. And malaria is on the list. So what would be ideal could be maybe even a combination, maybe a hookworm with malaria vaccine, right? So you have to really, sometimes I have to tell you, we come up with some crazy ideas, but that's how it has to be, okay?
Okay, thank you. We got one more question, but I just want to, Sam Sampson, our network director, who's had to leave unfortunately, but she just wanted to partially correct me about my comment about South Africa having a high-income country within a low-income country. She said it's somewhat true, but it varies regionally even within South Africa. So a correction there. Kieran's asked another question. How does mobile reporting compare with traditional surveillance in capturing early causes? And how does language literacy and digital familiarity influence the app usability? It's a really good question.
Okay. The main thing is to training the people because the mobile application doesn't work alone. So you need to train the people. So the strategy that we did was training the community health leaders from several rural areas. We create the books that I show you in order that they use this book in their communities to help and to teach the community what about leishmaniasis is. This is the first issue, train the people. The second is that the mobile application has a rule of prediction rules. The prediction rules is a test or is a scale with several questions, and they have a score. If the score is higher than 7, the probability to have cutaneous leishmaniasis is high. So the idea is they apply this prediction rule and after refer to the health system. So this prediction rule helps to detect the early stage of cutaneous leishmaniasis. This mobile application was done after the evaluation of this prediction rule. And the first mobile application was the prediction rule, and the second is the patient follow-up. So you can find those articles, they were published. How the language literacy and digital familiarity, okay. Yes, we design an application based on the patient center. So we did a patient centered design. We use mainly image photographs, and in order to facilitate the comprehension on the indigenous communities and other communities. But the other is to select very well the community health leaders, because if they don't have a good comprehension, it's difficult to be a leader. So you need to do a training. You need to train the people. You need to evaluate the comprehension, but use a patient-centered design with the image in order to facilitate the process. But definitely, the language and literacy affect the usability of the mobile health or mobile applications.
Great. So oh, Maria Del Mar, do you have a question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you both. Very nice presentations. I have a question for Maria Elena, Dr. Bottazzi. It's related to the negotiations with the developers or the producers of the vaccines for diseases that have maybe not such a big market. Like, for example, if you think, like hookworm, the example that you presented, I think Leish is maybe less probably a bigger market, but there are like Brulios, right, that they are very niche, very specific endemic areas, how those negotiations happen. That's one part of the question, or my first question. And then the second one is related to like what is your experience on this kind of keeping the market prices, right? I will put the example of a few years ago of miltefosine, right? Like in the initial development, it was this public-private partnership. It became to the market, but eventually it changed hands, and the price was completely 3 times more than was the agreed price. So how do you handle this?
Yeah.
Things?
Yeah, and again, that's the reason why, eventually you may all have to think, right, that, science is not enough, and you have to learn how to be savvy with these more legal frameworks or even business understanding, right? So you're right? You can enter the conversation with very solid, why is this so important? Why there's so much a need, right? The epidemiology, there's, the burden, right? That basically attracts these developers because that maybe they have a volume market, right? Again, right? Millions of people at $2 a dose still can give them some, I guess, economics compared to maybe the opposite, which is the challenges that the rare diseases face, right? Which is a little bit of people, but of course, maybe they have a little bit more opportunity of charging a lot of money. So you enter through there, right? You make a case. And then I think you're right. I think that unfortunately, as much as they may be public sector producers, some of them, of course, are private. Some of them are state-owned or, kind of public-private partnerships. Eventually, you have to show them the economics, right? You have to show them how they can build the information to then create the market and make and do the numbers. I mean, unfortunately, is do the numbers, because then they have to approach who will eventually be buying these vaccines, and in this case are the countries which eventually wants to make these as public goods. So you're right. I mean, and I think that's why you don't start calling them when you already have very cool data in the lab or even in the clinic and say, oh, you have to start when you're even designing the vaccine, because maybe they come to you and say, look, I would definitely be interested, but I wanted to feed into already the technology that I'm an expert with. Maybe they actually tell you, this is a great example for me to play around with learning a new technology, for example, RNA, right? Or maybe this is a great opportunity to do it as a combination assessment, right? So start really early. And then with regards to what you said, right, this is kind of like, change control, right? Like you said, you start with an agreement with organization company X, and then that company X is bought, and then the new buyers don't abide or change the rules. And so you have to then be very savvy of how to put those clauses in your agreements. I mean, we do that, right? We're very clear, right? We want not, for example, our philosophy usually is non-exclusivity, meaning, I'm not going to enter into a deal just with one group. I want to have the flexibility that I can work, with multiple. You can then design what that non-exclusivity means. Another one is that, right? That if there is a change of hands, the whoever new hands have to honor the original intent, right? And if not, they have to pay a fine or, have some repercussions for it, right? Then for example, we always love to say, I mean, we don't necessarily want any money. What we want is an opportunity to co-develop and learn, right? So knowledge sharing. So there's a lot of ways to do it, which of course you have to then learn to work with your institutional licensing officials. And I appreciate that sometimes they are not very savvy, especially in the nonprofit or in the academic sector, and sometimes arguably in our Latin American countries or else, there's not a lot of even skills in the whole licensing or intellectual property. But then you have to work with groups that usually help even in pro bono ways, how to really craft these types of agreements. But you have to, of course, have it very clear from the beginning, right? You cannot decide it off the cuff, last minute, right? But it's a lot of work, constant and a lot of work. That should not, of course, stay away from the science drives decisions, but has to be complemented with the non-scientific challenges. There's no way out, right? Just by saying, a vaccine is needed, it would save so many lives. It just doesn't move the needle. I tell you, it's so sad to say it, but it is true. Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Maria Del Mar, for that brilliant question. And it's rather appropriate because I think we should wrap up now, because our next speaker taking place in 1 week's time will be Maria Del Mar, who will be talking about bridging the gap between, patient involvement in leishmaniasis product development. So that's taking place in 1 week's time on the 21st of January. I put the link in the chat, so do come along to that. But for right now, I would like to thank Maria Elena and Alexandra for 2 excellent talks. If you could show your appreciation somehow, I think the best way to do it is the reaction button, like this. There we go. And there we go. Lots of applauses. So thank you very much for a brilliant first outing for Validate in 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A pleasure to see all of you over Zoom.
Yes, it's great. It's a really good turnout. Really happy. Thank you very much,
Nice to share this with Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Maria Elena, and the audience. See you soon in the next seminars.